A warm welcome to everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening or this morning from wherever you are. And welcome to our discussion today on environmental sustainability in the self-care and healthcare industry. My name is Jessica Chiam, and I'm the founder and managing director of EcoBusiness, and I'm delighted to be your moderator today. Today, we are focusing our discussion on a critical topic that has been under the radar in the media, as well as the political and business landscape. But it is one of critical importance. Climate change is the greatest threat to health and well-being in the 21st century, and its effects are now well documented. From extreme weather events to sea level rise, biodiversity loss and resource scarcity, climate change affects us all. But beyond physical effects, it also has health impacts, contributing to rising cases of heat stroke, cardiorespiratory illnesses, and vector diseases globally, just to name a few. But at the same time, the healthcare sector is part of the problem. If it were a country, the healthcare sector would be the fifth largest emitter of greenhouse gases. The global pandemic crisis triggered by the COVID-19 virus has also seen an explosion of the use of single PPE equipment and testing kits, generating unprecedented volumes of waste around the world. It is therefore an urgent task that we face as a society in achieving equitable health systems. And this is why today's discussion on sustainability in the consumer healthcare industry is so important. Last year, the Global Self-Care Federation has launched the first of its kind Environmental Charter, and you'll be hearing details on it very shortly in this webinar. The Charter is a perfect example of collective action of the private sector to reduce its impact on the environment without compromising on health outcomes, product safety, and access for consumers. The Environmental Sustainability Charter calls on members of GSCF to commit to concrete pledges addressing three priority areas: plastics and packaging, pharmaceuticals in the environment, and carbon footprint. With the IPCC report issued recently warning that the world is set to reach the 1.5 degrees Celsius level within the next 2 decades. And beyond political action, corporate ambition is critical in achieving our climate targets. So there is much that the healthcare industry can do to maximize impact and to promote positive change and to contribute to the UN's decade of action. So today, we are very honored to have with us some leading experts in the field to share with us their perspectives on what the consumer healthcare industry is doing to reduce its impact on the environment and why it is important. So now allow me to introduce our speakers, and can I invite our speakers to turn on their cameras as well? Joining me are Dr. Rüdiger Kresch, the WHO Director for Health, as well as Mr. Pieter Barkai, Circular Economy Lead at the OECD Environment Directorate, as well as Ms. Daniela Foster, Global VP and Head of Public Affairs, Science and Sustainability at Bayer. We're going to have an interesting panel discussion coming up, so I encourage all our participants here to think of some good questions for our speakers. But first, to kick us off, I'd first like to invite the speakers to provide some introductory remarks. So Dr. Kresch, could I first invite you to give your opening statement?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Jessica, and very good morning, good afternoon to all of you. Thanks for the kind introduction. So health promotion is actually the process to enable people to take control over and to improve their health. So we are in the midst of various crises. Jessica, you mentioned, of course, the climate crisis, which is huge. But at the same time, we're in the midst of a pandemic, and we're in the midst of a huge social crisis with a lot of hate, fake news and misinformation at the same time. That's hugely important for self-care at the same time, because something happened a long way from us in many parts of the world, and it has actually impacted all our lives for the last 2 years. And especially people with chronic disease were not receiving the care they should have received. Managing their own care was hugely compromised as well. And so we need to think differently about societies. We need to reboot societies. And I'm going to talk about this in a few minutes. So thank you very much for this introductory possibility.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Crash. And can I invite Peter now to give his opening remarks?
Thank you, Jessica, and thanks for the introduction. And let me just see if I can manage to share my slides. Okay, I hope you can all see this. Excellent. Well, thank you very much for the opportunity here on this distinguished panel. And let me maybe start by just saying 2 words about the OECD, the organization that I represent here, because it may not be known to everyone. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development is an intergovernmental think and do tank that has its headquarters in Paris and around 4,000 staff, 38 member countries, most of them highly developed industrial nations. And our main business is really policy advice, advising our governments on policies. And my specific area is the circular economy. What I want to do just with a few slides that I have is to maybe help us set the scene a little bit from the environmental standpoint. There are 2 reports. Well, there's actually 1 report that we published just a few weeks ago on plastics that I want to briefly speak about. And this, of course, ties in with the plastic packaging topic, which your charter does focus on. And then there is a second report, which we will launch just in a few weeks from now, which more specifically focuses in on household level pharmaceutical waste. So with that, let me just move to the next slide. And so, of course, all of us know that the use of plastics has increased exponentially over recent years. And this is also translated into an equal increase in the amount of plastic waste that is generated. And what you can see here on the slide is that packaging really accounts for 40% of that waste. So it is a very large share of that pie. Just quickly through the other parts of that pie, but I won't speak to them. You see that plastics are really used all across the economy and different sectors. More important is, in general terms, more than half of plastic waste generated come from applications with very short lifetimes. And the current recycling rate is extremely low. So, what we did in our report, which is the Global Plastics Outlook, which is the Global Plastics Outlook, is that we mapped plastic flows through the economy at a global level all along the life cycle. And so what you can see here, and maybe if I can get the next click immediately, is of course that there's a huge amount of plastic that enters the economy as primary plastics. And then when that plastic reaches the waste stage, the end of life, which is still a huge amount, 353 megatons, some of it gets recycled, but it's really only 8%. A lot of it gets proper waste treatment, so it's either incinerated, landfilled, and some of it is mismanaged and littered, and it's actually quite a large share, 82 megatons, and that mostly appears in emerging economies, which are fast growing, of course. If I can get the next click, then you can see that a lot of that mismanaged waste then ends up in different environmental media, including, of course, in the aquatic environment. And I think this is why this is a very important topic for your industry as well. If I can then get the next slide, please. The second report really focuses in on household level pharmaceutical waste. If we can get the next click, please. So there are different, and this will be no news to people on this call, I expect, but there are different entry pathways of pharmaceuticals into the environment, and particularly fresh water. Of course, people excrete pharmaceutical molecules when they take medication. And if I can get the next click, what our report really focuses on, and that's really the majority, what we excrete is the majority of the emissions of pharmaceuticals. But what our report focuses on is probably also what is more manageable. This is when people flush their unused medicines down the toilet or throw it in the bin. And I think the background, of course, here is that over the last 20 years, the consumption of medicines has quadrupled. Growth is continued, is expected to continue at least another 50% to 2045. So this problem that I was just describing here is also expected to aggravate. Impacts, of course, are on ecosystems and ultimately also on people's health. So I will just stop there. And I also have positive messages, which I will bring later, because the positive message is that there is quite a lot that industry can do about this. And of course, I know that you're already on it.
Thank you so much, Peter, for that very insightful overview, and also the visuals, which I think are, a good reminder of how the healthcare industry really impacts our environment. I'd now like to invite Daniela, who's going to give us the business perspective. Over to you.
Thank you, Jessica, and hello, everyone, and welcome. It's a pleasure to be here with my esteemed panelists. So I'm Daniela Foster. I co-chair the Global Self-Care Federation's Environment Working Group. And one of the things I'm really excited to get into, as we've heard kind of the layout of some of the challenges, are, well, what are the solutions and how can we sort of start to tackle this? So last November, we launched the Charter for an Environmentally Sustainable Self-Care, which is the first ever consumer health industry-wide climate action resolution for the industry. So I'm very excited about this. And there are a few aspects that truly excite me about the promise of this charter and the pledges our member organizations have made. So first, when we think about climate action and improving health, those two are really inextricably linked. So we need to think of the environment in many ways as one of those social determinants of health. I think that's very critical. And also the work being done to become climate neutral is also one of the key aspects of helping community health. So we need to start, I think, being more overt about that link between human health and the environment. We also know that climate change has caused a lot of health issues. Some of this was talked about, whether it's respiratory illnesses, heart disease, allergies, and we also know that people in underserved communities are most vulnerable. So again, I think there's a big need here to start talking about the environment as a health issue and how the actions we can take collectively can create a healthier world. So second, a big part of this is collective action. So I truly think climate action is a team sport. The only way we're going to make substantial progress is through collective action and partnerships. So this is, I think, important. The charter specifically, which you see here, because it really helps unite our industry to drive that collective action. And when we look at really big systemic challenges, no one company or organization on their own are going to solve it. It's really by us coming together across competitive lines, across sectors, to look at, how do we bring our brain power and our resources together to tackle some of these challenges. So what you see here is the charter. There are three core focus focus areas in the charter. So first is reducing plastics and packaging. You just heard a bit about that challenge. And we all know that packaging, especially plastics, can have a big impact on the Earth's ecosystem. It's also important that we help people use products safely and preserve their quality. So this is why it's key, I think, for the industry to come together and work towards tangible solutions. And some of the ways that we can do this range from everything around best practice sharing on through to innovating and partnerships with suppliers and working with local governments to improve recycling. There's also a component which is innovation around materials, et cetera. The second area is pharmaceuticals and the environment. And here, this is where we'll work together to actively manage and reduce waste from our production facilities, encourage safe disposal of our products, share best practices. And then the third area is managing our carbon footprint. So in this area specifically, this is where we'll encourage and help members across the industry to reduce carbon emissions, specifically with a focus on science-based targets. And we're also creating frameworks for our industry to better understand and help reduce scope 3 emissions. So we have a really big focus here on scope 3 emissions, how we work with suppliers and across the value chain to reduce emissions. So with that gives you a bit of an overview. I'm really looking forward to having this conversation today. And I'm also looking forward to having even more organizations come together to drive collective action and hopefully help us advance what we're trying to do with the Charter.
Thank you so much, Daniela, for that. That was super interesting, and I think so encouraging to see the industry coming together and actually launching this charter that, you know, outlines very clearly the focus areas and what are some of the targets that we can hit together. So thank you for that. Now that you've met all our panelists, I'd like to jump into our panel discussion, which is going to be our main feature today. And then we're also going to have an audience question and answer. So I would like all of you to take the opportunity to ask questions of our panelists, you know, in our chat box, or you can also raise your hand virtually in the Zoom webinar. But perhaps I can start off this discussion really with kind of like taking a step back and discussing the bigger picture of creating well-being societies. And perhaps Dr. Crash, I can come to you first. You know, well-being has really come under the spotlight in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic. What do you think are some of the key challenges for the creation of well-being societies?
Yeah, thank you very much, Jessica. And indeed, let me spend just a little bit of introduction to what we understand by well-being societies. And I'm really grateful to Peter and Daniela for looking at specific aspects of that. The first is, as I said, we're in the midst of multiple crises that actually disable us from actually taking control over our health and lives. And Peter, you've outlined very well how this is affecting, you know, this circular economy or waste that we're seeing. Plastic waste, and we as WHO believe that we first need to actually do our own homework. So how can we, as a health sector, which is one of the biggest economies we have, how can we practices, and also, like you, Daniela, outlined very well as well, how can we do our bits in order to address the environmental and also the climate challenges. But at the same time, we have therefore come together because of these different crisis we're in, and we were inspired actually by the OECD on the well-being societies and how we measure this, because we need to get out of these crisis hopping and actually reboot our societies. So this has 5 components, and we've brought this together in the biggest health promotion conference we ever had in WHO, because heads of government and various ministers from finance, health, education, housing, transport, and many other sectors actually came together with also a lot of civil society organizations and academia to say, what do we need to do now? So the first thing is indeed looking at this planetary health. There is no health without environmental and planet health. So we need to take care of our planet. The second is that money makes the world go round. And so therefore we need to also change the way we're incentivizing or disincentivizing economy to actually invest in healthier, less polluting products, services, and commodities. And so therefore, there's a whole notion of well-being economies that look into how we can shift from the unhealthy products to the healthy ones, including obviously those that pollute our planet. So we need to do something to heal our planet. The third one is, the third action area is the governance, because a lot of this is governed by public institutions, the governments that need to be the stewards of this major shift towards health and well-being. And that means that we need to be very clear about what pollutes our environment, what is unhealthy for us. And so therefore, to make clear regulations, legal regulations, and also use the fiscal space, the fiscal power that governments have to incentivize those unhealthy products and subsidize those that actually do the healing of our planet and create healthier services for all of us. The fourth is to actually do this together. It's not something that we just can do for the benefit of everybody else, but we do need to do this together. That means we need to co-design those environments and communities so that we're understanding where we can actually do ourselves the healthy option and create this. And of course, last not least, we need to do this in partnerships with so many different sectors and actors that actually create these opportunities if we want to build these well-being societies. That is, in a nutshell, what is at stake. The big challenges, and you've asked for that, Jessica, and then I come to a close, is actually that in the past we have been talking about intersectoral collaboration a lot. The issue is we need to understand the agendas of the different sectors and actually then understand also what the potential health impacts of decisions in those other sectors are on health as well. And we need to sort of crowdsource the good ideas that are there. So in this conference, which we just had in December, and the result, which is the Geneva Charter on Wellbeing, we actually collected all the evidence in the economy so the macroeconomic benefits of a well-being economy. We have huge experiences on the ground of how you actually do joined up government, whole of government approaches that actually take charge of the effects of the harms to the planet and the harms to the humans, and to bring these different agendas closer together is both an opportunity because we know what to do and how to do it, but at the same time it's a challenge because we're not used to this way of working. So that remains to be then seen and experienced, how we're actually making good progress on this to come together. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Crash. I think that was such a good oversight of the definition of well-being societies and really how do we get there, the different pathways, and everything from governance to shifting industry practice to collaboration. So thank you so much for sharing with us on that. Peter, perhaps I could come to you. I mean, the OECD has many environmental and policy initiatives. How do they apply to the consumer healthcare sector?
I think, yeah, thank you for the question. And maybe before going there, I'd like, first of all, to say that in my opinion, the global self-care industry has a particular responsibility with respect to the environment because of what Daniela said, which is this intense linkage between environment and health. And an industry that is there, whose purpose it is to improve people's health, cannot be seen to do harm to the environment, on the other side of the coin. So I think there's a particular responsibility. What I was saying in my introduction is that luckily there's actually quite a lot that the industry can do by itself. Daniela has already mentioned a few things, and there were more on her slide. So maybe the first one to point out, and that's also something coming out now. I'm really talking about the waste management dimension here. I'm not talking about the carbon footprint of the industry. So the first one is better product design. That is clearly in the hands of the industry. It's also something that is extremely difficult to influence through policies, even though we're trying and we're experimenting, across our membership. But and clearly there are opportunities to develop more personalized and precision drugs. There are opportunities to better dimension the packaging sizes of pharmaceuticals. There are also opportunities to design less harmful molecules in the first place, i.e. ones that biodegrade relatively quickly, which is also sometimes called green pharmaceuticals. And finally, of course, there's everything that you can do, but what is probably better known to improve or reduce the environmental footprint of your packaging, such as making it recyclable with recycled content, etc. I think the other important contribution that industry can provide, and I think again this was already mentioned, is to contribute to consumer information and education, because a big issue, and we see that quite clearly in the work that we did around household level pharmaceutical waste, is the behavioral dimension at the household level, at the consumer level. And so there is an opportunity for the industry to inform consumers much better than until now. And finally, there is an opportunity for the industry to contribute to better collection of both pharmaceutical waste and also the related packaging, including by offering incentives and putting in place voluntary collection schemes, of which quite a few exist across OECD member countries. But then there are also limits, of course, to what the industry can do on its own. And Rüdiger underlined this quite strongly. There's a strong rationale here for policy intervention. I don't want to take too much time now. Maybe you can come back to that in a moment.
No, thank you, Peter. I think you raised some very important questions there, and also the critical role of industry, everything from product design to collection of waste. Maybe this is a nice way to segue into Daniela's perspective. I mean, from, the business perspective, do you think industry is responding to those needs for society to get them to address these issues? And what challenges are you facing?
Yeah, so look, I think the good news is that the challenges are known, and now we're starting to move into solution mode, which I think is incredibly important. I spent nearly a decade actually working in government and was very much focused on public-private partnerships. So I echo everything that was said around working together and the need for these things to work in collaboration. So I think that's critical. Look, I think this does start with putting a stake in the ground around commitments. Many of our member companies have, and in fact, when we launched the sustainable self-care, environmentally sustainable self-care charter, a key part of that was actually members coming on with their pledges and commitments. Now, commitments are just a start. There's a long journey. You've got to move from commitments to, near-term, mid-term, and long-term progress. But if I think about, Bayer, for example, and that's where I work. I mean, we've set our long-term goals around moving towards 100% recyclable, reusable, compostable packaging by 2030. That is, of course, going to be quite a journey. But part of that includes all of the things that were just mentioned. It includes working really closely with our R&D teams, working very closely with our design teams to look at, all right, how do we design differently? Where do we maybe not even need materials in the first place? What are those more sustainable and better alternatives? And Jessica, I know you also asked about challenges. There are also some challenges in this. I think the technology and availability of materials at scale has not yet arrived. I do think it will get there over time, but that's also where I believe in the power of collective action, because we have to sort of work together to think through, invest in, test, and also test safety and things like that, the viability of alternative solutions. And then you have the potential to really go to scale because you have a group coming together collectively to say, yes, we're committed to testing this, to learning, et cetera. So I do think that is a critical step. I also think there's a really big role for suppliers to play. We haven't touched on that as much, but if you think about the various stakeholders and the different touch points and how you need to sort of move towards that transition, I think working with them is critical. That's one of the areas we want to open up across the charter, open dialogues with suppliers, understand what are some of the roadblocks and challenges, what are some of the things that we can say, yes, we are all committed to X and we're going to move towards Y. So I think we have a good initial set of commitments, and there's an understanding that this is important, we're going to do it, we're focused on targets, and B, I think we're bringing the right people together to have these conversations. It's going to be a journey. I think it always is, but I think those pieces are critical. And then I also think the key component of this too is also working with the public sector. And having that, open dialogue, I think similar to what we're starting today, to understand, okay, we got the challenges, we understand some of the ecosystems we're dealing with. Now, how do we really move to solutions? And then how do we get those to scale? Because some of the solutions I see are great, but then the ability to scale them and really have a material impact is still a gap. So that's a key piece to get to.
Thank you very much, Daniela. I think those are really interesting perspectives. I'm just picking up on the point of, working with the public sector. If there was just one thing that you wish that they could change that will make your life much easier and for, industry to meet your targets, what do you think that would be?
Oh, Jessica, that's a big question. I probably need to marinate on that more. Look, one thing I would say up front, though, is that when I talk about collective action and partnerships, I do think it's really critical to have every sector represented. And I think the more that we can work together and have these open dialogues, and I think someone mentioned, Dr. Kresh, it may have been you mentioned the key to understanding in partnerships, what are the real needs? What are the roadblocks? And so I do think there's a part of this that is about true dialogue, trust. I think that's an important thing to build. And then also getting to all right, what can we practically do and how do we do that at scale? And really understanding within that, are there roadblocks that are systemic? If there are, how do you remove them? Are there, incentive systems and structures that don't work? If so, how do we evolve them? So I think that's a key piece of this. And Peter, I know you started to get into that on the policy side.
Thank you very much. Dr. Crash, would you like to respond to that?
Yes, very much so. And I couldn't agree more with you, Daniela, on the true dialogue. And very often it's, let's put it this way, it's very much on the surface. So once you understand what the real interests are, right, of the industry, of the various partners, and also then what can we do within this self-interest for the bigger, broader public good? Then we're, I think, really in business. And then it's the role of the governments to really steward this, to say, okay, we have all an interest here, which is common, and we are agreeing on certain steps by every of the stakeholders, of the actors. Then it's the stewarding to say, how can we incentivize you that you're really putting this into practice? And how can we also control this so that we are knowing that we know where we stand, and that we take people to account. It's not just then obviously the governments, but also civil society organizations. It's the academia that helps in putting people to, or taking people to account. And I think that's the new in this, that we're getting serious about this. If I may say, all actors in this are not unanimous. There's players that really take it seriously and profoundly wanting this change, and others who jump on the train and use it as corporate social responsibility. And there we need to make the difference, because it's not CSR at all. It's, if we're looking at where we are in planetary health, what the planet needs and what we need as humans, that all the plastic that Peter was talking about that ends up in the oceans will end up in us, and not only in our stomachs, but also in our brains. This is the newest evidence that we've gathered at WHO, is that the microplastic that is generated actually in the end breaches borders in our bodies. And so it's all in our self-interest to stop this and really have a radical change in this, because we do not have unlimited time for doing this. And that is, I think, if you ask me, what the biggest wish is for governments, is to take that stewardship role very seriously.
Thank you very much. I think that was, a very, very poignant, especially, about microplastics reaching the human body. I think there was also a story last week about it reaching basically being in our bloodstreams. And
that's it.
Yeah.
So it is in our bloodstreams, and therefore it also goes in our brains.
Yeah. So Peter, do you have a perspective on this, the role of governments and the stewardship in kind of getting the industry together to move in the right direction and in an accelerated manner as well?
Sure. Maybe just coming back to the threat to the environment that's represented by plastics. The threat to humans' health becomes, gradually more evident, even though there's, I think, no definite evidence of health impacts yet beyond, plastics that contain endocrine disrupting substances. But what scientists are also very concerned about is the accumulation of plastics in the environment, and there possibly being tipping points where entire ecosystems would collapse. Especially this has been brought up for ocean ecosystems, and these effects could potentially put our food security at risk, and have sort of knock-on effects. So there clearly is a very strong policy rationale for government intervention in this area. I think because we're also a little bit constrained in time, of course, there's lots that I could say, but I want to focus a little bit on one policy approach, which I think is also particularly well suited in bringing about this dialogue, trust, and partnership that I think both Rüdiger and Daniela have talked about. And that is extended producer responsibility, which in fact is both applied to packaging waste, but also in some countries to pharmaceutical household waste. And I think experience with this, so this is a policy approach where governments create an incentive framework within which the industry, actually the producers of the products that are targeted, can essentially put in place the most efficient way of managing that waste in an environmentally sound manner. And so extended producer responsibility for packaging waste is actually quite pervasively used across OECD countries, member countries, maybe with the exception of the United States, but there is some movement there at the state level, and probably bit by bit, extended producer responsibility for packaging waste is also going to be implemented there now. But there's very little in that way in the emerging economies so far, even though there are efforts in India, in Indonesia, in China as well. But functioning systems, that effectively ensure environmentally sound management of that waste and recycling do currently not exist. So there's a huge catch-up that needs to be undertaken there. Of course, extended producer responsibility systems in OECD countries are also not perfect, and they can be improved. And actually, all members also have a lot of work with that. So I don't want to point fingers here. On pharmaceutical household waste, the story is different. We only have a few countries that actually have mandatory extended producer responsibility systems for this kind of waste. It's really just a handful of countries, a few EU countries, and a few Canadian provinces. But what we see from the countries that have these systems in place is that the collection rates are way higher than countries that have other types of approaches, including voluntary ones. So I think, I think there is an opportunity here for this industry to seize, to support governments in establishing such systems, and then of course also financing them, because that is of course also at the heart of extended producer responsibility.
Thanks very much, Peter, for highlighting those policy approaches. I think the EPR is a key tool that a lot of Asian countries which were lagging behind are now actually using that, to kind of regulate the industry and to kind of get consumer behavior as well. And I think that, in terms of getting governments to play a key role, there is also the Global Plastics Treaty, the conversation that was started in Nairobi. And I think that that's going to be very critical in terms of helping to, get a global framework around plastic usage in the environment. So thank you for highlighting those. I would like to encourage our participants here to kind of submit your questions in the chat so that we can, ask our panelists these questions. And perhaps, while we're waiting for the questions to come in, I could ask Daniela a question around the charter. It's been some time since you've launched that. Can you tell us a little bit about the reaction of your stakeholders? Do they love it? What, are they coming on board? What are some of the reactions that you faced?
Yeah, happy to. And I also want to touch on something that Dr. Kresch said too, about the difference between CSR and true action that will drive impact. And maybe perhaps that kind of gets to this. I think that's critical. I think we have to drive towards science-based action that is going to have an impact. So that brings me a bit to the charter. I mean, one of the things that we're very supportive of, if I look at the CO2 footprint piece and the scope 3 emissions piece, is advocating for science-based targets. I think the science there is clear. I think the roadmaps there are clear. I think that helps us move the needle. I also think if I look at the space around, plastics and packaging and what we've been talking about, that's where there is that need for us, I think, to come together and to start to really say, okay, let's test and learn what works, what doesn't work, what are the unintended consequences, what can we scale. So that's what we're getting at through the charter. So since we've launched, we've had a phenomenal response. We're driving to have a majority of the industry behind this. So we're already at over a third. And I think, Dr. Kress, to your point too, around how do you bring people together, one of the things that we're really mindful of is we also have to meet organizations where they are. Everyone is at a very different stage. If I think about Bayer, we've been looking at this and considering this for a while. We're putting massive teams behind that. It looks a little different in other organizations. So that's part of what we're trying to get at is what are those challenges? What are those roadblocks? How do we come together collectively, share learnings, share best practices to help advance and kind of lift all boats around this? Ultimately, though, we've got to move to tangible action and tangible impacts and scalable solutions. So that's where we want to go. But we're also very committed to bringing the broader group under that tent so that we can advance that. We know that's key. We've talked also about the supplier piece. And then I think, of course, another part of that is dialogues like this, right? And how we also figure out what is that best solution with the public sector too, where there are more systemic challenges.
Thank you so much, Daniela. Perhaps while on the topic of charters, I can go to Dr. Crash. Why has the WHO decided to launch the Geneva Charter of Wellbeing now? Is there a particular reason, and what has been the momentum for this charter been?
Yeah, it's actually this momentum of urgency. We've been hopping from crisis to crisis for a decade now. We've not heard wake-up calls. We had epidemics before in this very young millennium, where there were incremental change. While there was huge commitment at the start, we had Ebola, we had H5N1, we had H1N1. We had SARS, and now we have COVID. And in these epidemics, member states and partners, there was an outcry for change and commitments. What we have seen on the ground was very little, very little. We've seen, external evaluations of weaknesses of pandemic preparedness in countries. Over 120 countries participated in those evaluations. Very few countries actually then had developed action plans, national action plans to come out of this. And even fewer had actually started to implement them. And that is then, in a globalized world like we have, a huge risk for a pandemic or an epidemic, first of all, to break out. So therefore, in WHO, we always said it's not a question whether or not we're going to have a pandemic, but only when. And I can tell you now that if we are not really rebooting our societies, addressing all the risk factors that we have identified in WHO, about 30 different risks that can lead to a next pandemic. If we're not rebooting our societies, if we're not taking this collaboration, this joined up government seriously, we will see another pandemic in our lifetimes. And this one will be more or even more devastating as the current one that we have. So there's no time to lose. We can see that the limits we go, because we're consuming much beyond the limits of our planet, this will lead to huge health risks and to outbreaks as well, if we're not taking this seriously. So the urgency that we've identified led to this Geneva Charter for Wellbeing, because at the same time, and that's the what shall I say, the thing we have to get to grips with is that at the same time, while we have all these major risks and these crises, we know the way out. We know the how to the details. Look at what Peter, what Daniela tells us. They know what to do and how to do it. We just need now to come together and be serious about this. And there's no one in the world else than us now here to ring the bell and say, wake up. We cannot waste this other wake-up call if we want to survive. And that is why we have put up this Geneva Charter that puts out exactly the how, the what, and that we need to come together on it. Yes.
Thank you so much, Dr. Crash. I think, that is, I guess, the leadership, the WHO is showing in terms of waking society up. And I think that is much needed. And I think also worth mentioning really that, COVID-19 had caught the world by surprise. And that was, very directly linked to zoonotic diseases and deforestation.
Yes.
And that link to planetary health is not so obvious to people who suffer the effects of the pandemic.
Yeah, but it was not a surprise to all those people who were working on this. It was just that people were not listened to. Public health was not listened to. And the crisis was politicized again. And that drives what then the crises, the social crisis that come from it. The hesitancy, the mistrust we see is because it was politicized, right? And that is what we need to really get to grips with if we want not to crack this world at the moment.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think about the suffering, and just what we've gone through the last 2 years. And, scientists are saying now disease X, would be far worse in the next round. So
that's it.
A lot to think about here. We have a very good question here from, our participants. And that really, a huge part of having everyone kind of bought into the charter and the sustainability initiatives also involves hospitals, healthcare workers, society in general. How is the OECD and WHO supporting the education and awareness gap? So I suppose this also touches on the workforce and talent and skills, and whether we are equipped as a global workforce to respond to charters like that and to the commitments that businesses have made as well. Any thoughts here? Peter, perhaps I'll come to you.
Well, I'm afraid my response might be a little bit disappointing, because at the OECD, we're not really in the business of educating the wider public or, particular groups in society. Our work is mainly around awareness raising, also in governments, policymakers. Those are our prime targets, and that's what our work analysis and messages are sort of tailored for. But I think, as I said before, I think the industry itself has a major responsibility in this respect, in terms of both informing consumers, working with the supply chains, but also working with governments, both central and local level, in helping set up an incentive framework that creates a level playing field, and that allows an effective and efficient implementation of the environmental goals that should be science-based, as I think Daniela said, and that we're trying to achieve.
Daniela.
I will, maybe just, in a moment, I would like to say something more general about the role, and I think Daniela has touched upon that before, the role that voluntary initiatives across the industry can play, and where I see some of the limitations as well.
Thank you very much, Peter, for that. Any perspectives from Daniela or Dr. Crash on gaps in awareness?
Yeah, sorry, Daniela, if you so at WHO we work a lot on health literacy. Health literacy means that you need to know and what is healthy and what is not. But then there's a huge no-do gap, right? So we know what is good for me, but I'm not perhaps doing it. And health literacy helps you to, first of all, look at what is true, the information that you're having, that this is evidence-based and not the, it's not just fake. So the second step is that you need to translate this information, what is good for you and healthy for you. You need to translate that into your everyday life. And thirdly, you need to then incorporate this so that you're appreciating this and then say, I'd better do X, Y, and Z rather than the other stuff. So to make then an informed decision on for your own behavior. And we know, of course, that for people like us in this panel, it's much, much easier than for many other people who do not have this opportunity, not only not having access to the information, but also living in conditions which are so unhealthy and so unequitable that actually their choices are much, much more limited than the ones we might take. And so therefore, health literacy efforts to address this no-do gap need to encompass those elements of societal structures as well as speaking plain language so that people can understand what I really need, right? So that together, then with the right government action to make the healthy choice the easy one, as we say in WHO, and the unhealthy one the more difficult one, then looks at this incentivizing, disincentivizing, which I was talking about at the start of this panel, right? So this is something where we have gathered a lot of experience around the world, how health literacy works, and how we need to address also the innovation, the ever faster technological changes in the future to actually then again enable people to take control over their health. That's so the good news is we know very well how to do this.
Absolutely. Thank you for reminding us that it's also our personal responsibility. Daniela, you wanted to share some thoughts?
Yeah, look, on the piece of health education and literacy, I couldn't agree more. I think it's critical. I think it's one of the areas, I know WHO does a lot on it, but it's often an overlooked area, right? It's not as sexy of a solution as a new technology or a new vaccine, but it is critical. It is critically important. And I think what's really important in that, there's one thing to sort of have the education and literacy. We know, I think another key component is meeting people where they are. And Dr. Kresh, you talked about that, particularly if we're looking at underserved communities. There are a lot of other issues and challenges that they're dealing with. So I think the importance of simplicity, the importance of meeting people where they are, and then the hardest part in all of this, but the critical part is the pull through. How do you actually then translate that into healthier behaviors? That is really hard. I think we all know that. That's what we're striving to do. It's really hard. But I do think that the health education and literacy plays a critical role. I think we saw that with the pandemic when things were as basic as washing your hands and hygiene, and it was simple and it was easily accessible and translated in different ways. People got it and they did it. So perhaps that's a silver linings learning in there. But I do think that this area is really critical.
Thank you very much for that, Daniela. And actually, while I have you here, there's an interesting question that's come in about the stigma actually of potentially reusing materials in healthcare. And, you know, I think in my intro remarks, I have mentioned that healthcare actually is the 5th largest emitter, if you take that as a sector, and it has been quite slow to respond to, I think, sustainability concerns. Do you think that this is something that industry needs to address? And then also consumer behavior, how do we get rid of that stigma of, like, I don't know, single-use plastics and so on?
Yeah, first of all, the health industry indeed is very often not the first to go. It's very often the last to follow. And that's the same with, the medical profession, where we're very much the last to jump on the train that is about to leave the station, like on this wellbeing societies. OECD has done a phenomenal job on looking at how you can create well-being societies and economies here. The health sector is one of the largest economies overall, so the sector as such, with $5.8 trillion on public healthcare costs at the moment, or investments. And to understand this as a growth market, which is an investment into people and their futures, and to then also see what the responsibilities go hand in hand with that sort of growth perspective of health, of the healthcare industry, is something we need to grapple with. Daniela, you mentioned, what individual industries are doing, especially pharmaceutical industries. At the same time, we have an access problem of a lot of medicines to all people, right? So, and with this goes, you can only increase this access for all with a huge of market potential, obviously, if you're getting the planetary effects, if you're addressing this challenge, because otherwise we cannot grow as a health market. Right, so there is a huge, interest and incentive, a self-interest in the pharmaceutical industry to get a handle on the problems that Peter was talking about. That, for instance, there's the medical waste that actually goes into the oceans. Right, it's not good enough to just say, oh, there's also users who need to know that you're not flushing the medicines through the toilet, but there's much more to it in the responsibility that is attached to the healthcare system overall, right? So, and health literacy programs would be part of this then, and perhaps a much greater investment also in those areas. If we had a polluter pay principle here, I'm sure that the partners would do much more on health literacy and looking at behavioral insights and behavioral science, how we're actually addressing this problem, right? So again, we need to get to grips with all this. And again, we know how to do it. It's just a matter of now be serious business.
Thank you. Daniela or Peter, any responses there?
Yeah, so I think, back to the question, it's a good one, which is healthcare can be slower. How do you sort of manage these transitions while also tackling safety and efficacy? And first of all, that's critical. We have to tackle safety. We have to tackle efficacy. I think, in many ways, when we look across healthcare and specifically consumer health, it is very different than when we look at the advances that have happened in consumer goods, right? It's very different when you're dealing with health. Highly regulated safety is first and foremost. So those things have to be there. They have to maintain. I would say if this was easy, everyone would have already done it. I can tell you it is very hard, and it is going to be a long journey. that's okay. I think the first step is committing to that journey, putting those tangible commitments behind it, working together and moving towards those solutions. So that piece is key, but yeah, it is slower, and it's definitely slower than consumer goods. And it's going to be because of that safety and efficacy component. And we cannot sacrifice that. We absolutely cannot. So the good news though, is we know it's going to be a challenge. I think we're all eyes wide open to it. And now we're working through okay, how do we tackle this? And what can we do collectively with academia, across various sectors, et cetera?
Thank you, Daniela. Peter, perhaps I can come to you. I mean, from the circular economy perspective, is there more we can do in terms of addressing the stigma or reusing materials in healthcare? And then perhaps I can attach the second question around health technology, or health tech solutions. Is that something that the industry is looking at and its role here?
So regarding the stigma of using recycled materials in healthcare, I guess it depends a little bit what we're talking about. Recycled molecules in the medicines. I'm not sure. I don't think we are anywhere near, that option, sort of technology-wise. So I think what we're talking about is using recycled material maybe in the packaging. And there, I'm not sure necessarily that there is a stigma yet, but there's certainly a risk of one developing. I think we haven't had like a huge crisis, that would have made headlines around recycled material affecting, people's health ultimately. So what is key here, of course, is actually relates back to something that I spoke about earlier, which is product design. So the way you design the packaging, which ensures that it can be separated into different material fractions easily, that it is easily recycled, and that ultimately you can get very high quality and ideally food contact material out of it. So of course there's big responsibility that lies with the industry itself. But chemicals management policies are also very important here, because they set a regulatory framework with respect to which substances are actually allowed for specific uses. So being more ambitious on our chemicals management policies is one way to ensure toxic-free material cycles, essentially, and so again, I mean, I think there is a risk of a stigma developing. I don't think there is a stigma yet. And I think we still have time to, more effectively maybe manage those risks, and a lot of policy initiatives and activity is currently going into that direction, certainly in the EU, also some other members of the OECD family.
Thank you. Perhaps taking one more last question from our participants here, and I could direct this question to Dr. Crash. It's quite an interesting one. Are there specific examples that you can share on policymakers focused on healthcare, talking to policymakers focused on biodiversity conservation? And are there any direct collaborations or examples of people talking to each other to address this issue?
Oh yeah, and in many countries so. And increasingly, I would say. So take the example of Costa Rica. Costa Rica has put biodiversity as one of their main policy goals, and all the sectors need to comply with that. So therefore, the Minister of Health has an interest in looking at the waste in the healthcare sector in a very different way, because he is incentivized, or she at the moment, is incentivized to reduce the waste in the healthcare sector in order to increase biodiversity. Look at New Zealand. New Zealand has put up a well-being budget, and that means that everything you do, if you want to increase the budget in your ministry, you need to show that you're contributing to people's well-being. And again, this has to do a lot with biodiversity and how you're actually looking at planetary health in your actions. So if you want to expand your portfolio as a minister, let's say, of health, then you need to actually show that you're contributing to this well-being. And I could go on and on. Japan has just launched a 6-month dialogue on well-being, how to get out of these crises, and what the government can do in this. And again, the health minister has a key role to coordinate, to facilitate this partnership, to mediate between different interests. So very new roles coming along for the ministers of health here.
Thank you, Dr. Crash, for all those examples. Very interesting. Perhaps one last question to Daniela. And the question is that there are many countries, I guess the developing ones, the least developed countries especially, who struggle with the effects of climate change, and they might not have the resources or the infrastructure to address public healthcare systems and least of all make it sustainable. As the industry, how are you thinking about kind of making it equitable across all the different countries?
This is a great question, and I think Peter and Dr. Kresh spoke to this a little bit. When we look at these systems, one key word that sticks out to me is resilience. It is really important that we look at how we're helping to build, facilitate, support resilient communities. And when we talk about resilient communities, it's not often about just, infrastructure and tech and all of those things that you might not see in your low and middle income countries. It's very much about capacity building, local community healthcare workers, health education and literacy that we talked about, meeting people where they are and understanding how you transition to healthier behaviors, layering into that more sustainable behaviors and activities, et cetera. So I do think the focus on resiliency is critical, and that, again, to kind of, I guess, round us out with where we started, you get to resiliency when you have that collaboration across sectors, public sector working with NGO, working with private sector, all saying, hey, and local community healthcare workers, how can we all come together to build these more resilient communities? I think that's critical.
Thank you very much. Any other responses on this? Go ahead, Dr.
Yeah, again, I couldn't agree more with you, Daniela, on this. And actually, the COVID pandemic has shown this, a lot of strengths, a lot of solidarity, especially at the start, but so many weaknesses in all areas of our lives, right, that we didn't consider before. So this is really an exercise, also a learning for us. What happens if health is not part of the decision-making here? And we learned from the Ebola crisis in 2015 that we needed resilient health systems. I think we're learning now in COVID that, Daniela, you're right, we need resilient societies. And that means looking at communication. How do we communicate during a pandemic? How do we actually, make sure that love trumps hate? How do we make sure that evidence prevails? How do we make sure that we're using the best hour of our brains to get out of a crisis? How do we make sure that people do not fall through the cracks? If you look at the pandemic, it was those who couldn't afford who suffered the most. So we knew these inequities before, but the pandemic has laid it bare. So let's all learn from this now and reboot our societies, make societies resilient, as you say, Daniela, and then we're much, much better prepared for a next pandemic, which will then come if we're not, as I said, addressing all those risks.
Thank you very much, Dr. Crash, for that. Peter, any thoughts?
Sorry, was looking for the button. No, I mean, I think I can only agree, and also just underline how important the well-being lens really is here. Again, because this is really what allows us to bring, the economy together with, the environment and health. And you need to have a comprehensive view really to also make the right decisions and deal with trade-offs.
Thank you. I think just with an eye on the time, it would be opportune to kind of bring this that panel discussion to a wrap. I have one last question for all of you, and it's a quick fire round. And basically, it's the one key message that you would like to leave, or perhaps if you had a magic wand and there was one thing that you wish would change, or that you wished for in improving sustainability in the healthcare industry, what would that be? Peter, I will start with you.
I think the one thing that I really picked up here is there is an acute need for scale up. So we have a lot of interesting pledges, voluntary, collective, voluntary initiatives. They are excellent in terms of showing what's possible, revealing best practices. But ultimately, they will probably fall short of achieving the necessary scale because you have, free riding, going on. Not everybody, playing by those rules. So ultimately, scale up really needs to be supported by well-designed policies that create an incentive framework that lifts everybody up, to the same level.
Thank you, Peter. Daniela, I'll come to you. Your key takeaway or wish.
Yeah, that is that collective action would help to drive impact. And we've talked a bit about that throughout the course of our time today. I think also one of the other key takeaways is the importance of coming together across sectors, the importance of building trust, listening and understanding so that we can get to that scale, which is critical. So that's what I would say as I think about the reflections from today.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Daniela, for that summary. And Dr. Crash, last but not least.
Yeah, it's the importance to connecting the dots, getting this all together. It's challenging, but it's not a miracle. We can do this. Of course, as we've seen so many crises now over time in just the last 15 years, there's this urgency to act. Every crisis that is not resolved, looking at the sources of the crisis, will actually produce another crisis which is more severe. So therefore, there's no time to lose. It's not the icing on the cake to have this intersectoral collaboration, this coming together, but it's the essence of modern societies in a globalized world.
It's a very aspirational note to end off. Thank you so much, Dr. Crash, and thank you to all the speakers for all your insightful remarks. I've learned so much from all of you today. I think we've covered, quite a wide range of issues in consumer health industry addressing sustainability, but also more importantly, how can the industry address these concerns without compromising on health outcomes, product safety, and access. So if I could just maybe summarize for all our participants here today, the new environmental charter here really has 3 key objectives. One is to create a forward-looking platform and joint ambition for all members globally. The second, to develop the first global commitment from the consumer healthcare industry to drive environmentally sustainable self-care. And then third, and finally, to maximize impact and promote positive change across the industry. The UN has labeled this decade as the decade of action. So I think, drawing on everything that the speakers have shared today to accelerate that action would be something that we can all, focus on and take away from this conversation. So I would like to encourage all of you to read more about the Charter, to deep dive into it about yourself. You can find out more on the GSCF's website, selfcarefederation.org. And in the meantime, we will also be posting a recording of this video on our EcoBusiness website. So please do look out for it, as well as all the communications that we're going to follow up with. Thank you so much to our speakers for really your participation, your insights, and your time. And thank you for all those also participating in this engaging discussion and for all your questions. I really appreciate your time, and have a good evening and a good day.